Hi, everyone, and welcome to Ask the Horse Live. I'm your host, Michelle Anderson. Tonight, we're busting equine nutrition myths and talking about how to best feed your horses. The event is sponsored by Purina. To answer your questions, we're joined by two expert panelists, Dr. Clair Thunes, who is an independent equine nutritionist who owns Clarity Equine Nutrition, and Dr. Robert Jacobs, who's an equine innovations manager at Purina. Welcome to both of you.
Hi, great to be here.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
So we're going to start with you, Dr. Thunes. Can you tell us what you do in your role as an independent equine nutritionist and what that means?
Yeah, absolutely. So I'm basically an equine nutrition consultant. So I get hired by owners, vets, trainers to help them put together diet plans for their horses in their care. And then I also do some consulting work for feed and supplement companies, helping them with product development, sales team training, technical writing, that kind of thing. So do a little bit of everything.
And Dr. Jacobs, so your title is interesting. So what does it mean to be the Equine Innovation Manager with Purina?
Yeah, absolutely. It basically means that I get to manage the research and development process that goes on for Purina Animal Nutrition as it relates to the horse business. So I work with a phenomenal group of people at our Purina Animal Nutrition Center in Gray Summit, Missouri, where we house, amongst other species, but we also have 80 head of horses that range in age from a couple of days old all the way up to our senior horses. And we do research into all different areas of nutritional physiology, including taste and palatability, eating behavior, exercise, growth and development, reproductive physiology. And then one of my new favorites is the microbiome. And so my role is to develop new horse feeds, develop new horse formulas, and take those from the R&D stage all the way up until they are available on the shelves for you to feed to your horses.
Okay, so you mentioned microbiome, so I'm going to go ahead and ask you a question right now before we jump into our actual questions. Can you tell our audience a little bit about what the microbiome is so that they understand?
Sure.
Yeah.
For sure, yeah. The microbiome is such a fascinating topic. You know, at the base level, the microbiome simply means all of the bacteria, viruses, protozoa, and yeast that inhabit a certain part of the horse's body. You know, for our purposes, we really focus on the microbiome in the horse's hindgut, so in the large colon and the cecum of the horse. The microbiome of the horse, and we'll speak specifically to the bacteria, are largely responsible for the digestion through fermentation of the indigestible fibers that the horse eats. So all the grass, the indigestible portions of the grass and the hay and the concentrates that we feed our horse. And those bacteria produce really important components called the volatile fatty acids that the horse needs as an energy source. But more importantly, we're learning about the microbiome's role in everything from health and disease to exercise, performance, growth, development, immune function, all of these different fascinating topics. And so, you know, in my mind, the microbiome truly is the next frontier, not only equine nutrition, but nutrition as a whole.
Okay, well, with that, I'm going to go ahead and give our audience a overview of our format for Ask the Horse Live. So we're going to start with the questions that people submitted during registration. If you're listening live and you'd like to submit a question, you can do so via the app that you're listening through. We're going to do our best to get to as many of your questions as possible, and feel free to ask follow-up questions as the doctors are answering the questions. If you're listening to the podcast recording of this event and you'd like to join us live in the future, please visit thehorse.com/askthehorse live to register for notifications. Okay, Dr. Thunes, let's start with you. We have a question from Lorraine in Canada, and she has a 17-year-old mare who's a Tennessee walker, and she said that she has huge crest and fat pockets, even with limited pasturing and wearing a grazing muzzle. Is there a supplement that will help her with this? So can we talk a little bit about what might be causing those pockets of adiposity?
Yeah, absolutely. So, you know, we all, unfortunately, lay down extra body fat when our calorie intake is greater than our expenditure, right? So it's called being in a positive energy balance. And if you consume more calories than you need, your body stores that for times of famine as body fat. And some of our horses do that extremely well. Tennessee walkers would be a breed, in my mind, that do that quite well. Some of our other, what we affectionately term kind of our thrifty breeds, also do that very well. Everything from Welsh mountain ponies to Morgan horses to Pasafinos to Mustangs all those kind of what I think of as like old breeds, the breeds that really get by really well on not very much. And then today we tend to feed diets that are, more digestible, great hay quality and the like. And so they often, their genetics are such that they are very good at laying down body fat. There's also the potential that a horse that's developing a lot of fat pockets and crest fat is suffering from a condition called insulin dysregulation, or perhaps on a bigger scale, equine metabolic syndrome. So insulin dysregulation is when a horse doesn't respond to insulin the way that it should. When we eat, simple carbohydrates go into the bloodstream, starch, sugar, and the body really wants to keep that circulating glucose at a pretty tight range. And so in response to increasing blood glucose, we secrete insulin, and insulin helps kind of get that glucose out of the bloodstream, store it mostly in our muscle tissue, some of it also in the liver. And if that doesn't work properly, if we're not as sensitive to insulin as we should be, then that whole metabolic process starts to break down, and those horses can start to really store fat quite well. And that can then develop into something called equine metabolic syndrome. Horses that have equine metabolic syndrome, there are three things. They have to be overweight, obese, have laminitis or a history of laminitis, and be insulin dysregulated. And the reason we care about this is that those horses have a higher risk of developing laminitis. And in fact, there was a research study I recently read about, which was really interesting. They looked at, I want to say it was like 350 ponies over like 4 years, and they did all kinds of measurements on them, body condition scoring, weight taping them, took blood work on them. And over the 4 years, they saw how many of those ponies developed laminitis. And it was something like 70 something of the 300 and something ponies developed laminitis. And when they went back to their data and said, what did we know that could have predicted which of these ponies was going to get laminitis? It was the ones that had elevated insulin. So we really worry about this, kind of combination of metabolic issues, because it can unfortunately increase laminitis risk. So, in the case of this particular horse, he is of a breed that perhaps is a little higher at risk of that. Lorraine mentions that she's using a grazing muzzle, which is excellent. These horses really do benefit from limiting their access to pasture. Using a grazing muzzle has been shown to reduce pasture intake by, I think it was almost 85%. Horses eat large amounts of pasture. Some of the things, like when I was a kid, we'd sort of say, oh, we'll just turn them out for less time, right? So instead of turning them out for 8 hours, we turn them out for 4 hours. Well, research has shown that they're not stupid. They just eat faster. So that really doesn't work. So if you're going to put these horses that kind of gain weight very easily on pasture, grazing muzzle really is your friend. But I have some concerns here, though, because Lorraine mentions that the horse is developing huge crest and fat pockets even with the grazing muzzle. Mm-hmm. So, the question is about, is there a supplement to help? I'm going to be a little harsh perhaps and say, I think we have to take a deep breath and really ask the tough question of, should this horse be on pasture at all? Because if it's getting these fat pockets and a cresty neck, even wearing a grazing muzzle, this may be an individual who shouldn't be on any pasture. And I know that's a tough pill to swallow for a lot of people, but there are horses out there that's a reality for them. And I'm not one for Band-Aids. So, there are supplements out there that can help with insulin dysregulation if that's the underlying cause of this horse's fat deposits. And so I would actually encourage her to get the vet involved, get some blood work drawn, really figure out what you're really dealing with. Is this an insulin dysregulated horse? Are we looking at a potential risk of laminitis because it is insulin dysregulated? I want the data. I want to know what I'm really dealing with. And then make a plan. And there are some things like resveratrol that have been shown to help improve insulin sensitivity. So if that is part of the problem, something like that might help. But I think we're really looking at an overall management plan, part of which may be no access to pasture, increasing exercise if possible. We need to get the energy expenditure up so that we're hopefully burning more calories than we're taking in. And that'll help get rid of some of those fat pockets as well. The vet may decide if the horse is quite overweight that there is a need for medical intervention, and there are things that can be done there too. But it's really about a whole management plan and getting your vet involved.
Dr. Jacobs, our next question is for you, and it is from Pierre in California, and it's everyone's favorite topic, which is beet pulp. Pierre wants to know, will feeding beet pulp increase the chance of a horse choking? Can you talk to us a little bit about maybe why you'd feed beet pulp, and then if there is a choking risk and what you might do to mitigate that if that's a concern?
Yeah, absolutely. Beet pulp is one of those phenomenal ingredients that, for a while had a little bit of a bad rap about it. It's a byproduct. Should we be feeding it to horses? And more and more we're identifying beet pulp as really a phenomenal ingredient for horses, right? It's a high fiber ingredient derived obviously from sugar beets that are used and grown in the country mainly for the production of sugar. But in addition to being high in fiber, it's low in sugars, it's low in starches and sugars. And so Dr. Thunes was talking about horses that may benefit from not being on pasture, but what's the fiber source in that horse's diet? Well, beet pulp may be a good option, or at least a part of that horse's diet. And so beet pulp is offered and fed in a variety of different ways. There's a lot of commercial concentrates that incorporate beet pulp, whether that be beet pulp shreds, so varying sizes of that beet pulp itself, and a variety of ground beet pulp as well that's either incorporated into a pellet or otherwise in the diet. But commonly, people are feeding beet pulp to horses in its shredded form by itself. And typically, this shredded form is offered in two different ways. One with molasses added to it, and one with no molasses. So that's an important consideration to make. The one that has added molasses will have added non-structural carbohydrates. So for those horses that have those sensitivities to non-structural carbohydrates that are eating beet pulp, you do want to make sure you're feeding them the beet pulp that doesn't have the added molasses to it. But when people are feeding beet pulp to their horses, one of the recommendations that a lot of people have is to soak that beet pulp, right? There is some thought and really kind of urban myth that when you feed that horse dry beet pulp, that it soaks up all the saliva and it causes an esophageal obstruction, or better known as a choke, in horses. And while the data is kind of not really supporting of that, the data does support that feeding soaked beet pulp does reduce the chance of esophageal obstruction due to choke. And I want to be very clear, that horses, beet pulp, feeding soaked beet pulp does not increase the risk of choke in horses. However, if your horse does have a previous experience with choke, or your horse has choked in the past, that does put them at risk to choke again in the future, right? As the horse chokes, it actually causes some damage to the esophagus, which can cause swelling, which can cause the deposition of scar tissue in a bad enough case, which can actually reduce the overall opening in that esophagus, which then can make that horse at risk of choke again. So I think it's very important for horse owners to have an understanding of what their horse's individual risk for choke is. Other things that you can do to reduce the risk of choke when feeding beet pulp is to try and reduce the consumption rate. That horse, the rate at which that horse is consuming that beet pulp. And you can do that in a variety of different ways, offering, smaller mini meals to the horse. I've actually seen people, feed in a larger pan, and they've actually put softballs and larger, things that the horse can't break and take bites of in that pan. So the horse has to move it around in a way to provide some stimulation, but also, cause that horse to slow down their eating. And then also feeding in a pan on the ground. We've actually done some research where we've actually seen horses chewing in a much more natural way when their feed is being fed to them in a pan versus being fed to them at chest height. And by a pan, I mean a pan on the ground. And so I think it's important to take all of these things into consideration when you're thinking about choking your horse. But bringing it kind of full circle back to beet pulp, no, beet pulp will not increase the risk of choke. I do recommend that people do soak the beet pulp that they feed to horses, and it also gets more water into that horse's diet as well, which is also a great thing, helps to lubricate the esophagus and get feed, passing into the horse's GI tract.
We have a question that's come in from our live audience. Dr. Thunes, I'm going to give this one to you. It's from Mary, and she wants to know, what does it mean if a horse has a hay belly?
Oh, that's a great question. So sometimes that can mean that there's a lot of indigestible fiber in the diet. And so actually we talked about this briefly at the beginning when Dr. Jacobs was explaining, what the microbiota is and kind of what it does. And he mentioned that, we tend to think about the bacteria, that they're really responsible for the fermentation of the structural carbohydrate in the diet. And so there are many different types of carbohydrates in the equine ration. Everything from starches and sugars, which I think is what we think of when we think about carbs. But fiber is also a carbohydrate. So, and there are fibers that are easily fermentable. So when we were talking about beet pulp, we just heard that beet pulp has a lot of readily fermentable carbohydrate, which makes it a very useful feed ingredient. And then there are other forms of structural carbohydrate that are not as easily fermentable. And as our hays become more mature, meaning that when the plant has been left in the field for a longer period of time, so that the grass or whatever it is, the alfalfa, whatever the plant is being turned into hay, becomes more stemmy before it becomes cut, the more structural carbohydrate there is. So the more mature the hay is, the stemmier it is, the more structural carbohydrate there is, and potentially that's going to take longer to ferment because the carbohydrates in that are kind of more complicated for the bacteria to break down. So, when I think of a hay belly, I often, I'm always curious about what the quality of the hay is that's being fed, and is it, a stemmier, more mature, slightly less digestible type of hay than another one that perhaps, wouldn't cause a hay belly.
And we have a follow-up question about beet pulp for Dr. Jacobs. Heather is asking whether it's a myth that adding beet pulp increases the sugar levels in your horse's diet. So we just touched on carbohydrates, but I think it's that sugar beet name that can be confusing to horse owners. So Dr. Jacobs, what are your thoughts on that?
For sure, you're absolutely correct. Sugar beet pulp or sugar beets, from which beet pulp is derived, kind of give it that connotation that it is high in sugars. But no, beet pulp, and again, I just want to point out, beet pulp that does not have added molasses to it is not high in sugar. It's low in non-structural carbohydrates. It's high in that fermentable fiber. That's an important component, an important carbohydrate for that horse, but it does not add an appreciable amount of sugar into that horse's diet.
We have another question from our live audience. Dr. Thunes, I'm going to give this one to you. It's from Cynthia, and she says that the barn where she boards her horse at is against her using a pelleted feed, and they say that pellets aren't good for horses. Why might they think this? Is there any rationale for not wanting to feed pellets?
Yeah, absolutely. And I'm assuming she's possibly meaning a hay pellet. Pellets don't take a lot of chewing to break down, right? They're almost kind of pre-chewed. They've been ground, the particles in the pellet have been ground to a very small size and then forced through a die under pressure and heat to create that pellet. And so when the horse chews it, they just kind of crumble and fall apart into many, many tiny particles. So a pound of pellets takes an awful lot less chewing than, say, a pound of long stem hay. So there's a couple of concerns there. One is that they're going to be done with their meal quicker and then potentially get bored and have nothing to do. Secondly, horses are designed to eat for long periods of time, right? Horses left to their own devices eat 16, 18 hours a day. We tend to meal feed them because it's convenient. Many of our horses don't have access to continuous pasture and are meal fed, and many horses, don't have the luxury of free-fed hay, or if they got free-fed hay, they'd be obese. So that becomes tricky too. And pellets, because they eat them so much more quickly, there's that risk that they're standing around for a longer time. And the digestive tract is really designed for a small trickle of fibrous food throughout the whole day. The stomach is constantly secreting stomach acid when horses are grazing, and they're kind of, chewing grass for 16 plus hours a day. While they're doing that, they are creating saliva, and equine saliva buffers stomach acid. So it's a beautiful system of continuously secreted stomach acid that's needed for the start of the kind of digestion process, and continuously secreted saliva that buffers that stomach. So we've got sort of a less acidic situation there. But when we meal feed and they stand around for long periods of time not chewing, you get buildups of acid and less buffering potentially. The other thing that kind of forage and fibers do is they float on the top of that stomach and make a nice mat, kind of like a natural fiber doormat, and they stop the acid splashing about in the stomach. So again, they help reduce the risk of ulcers. And the microbes in the microbiome in the hindgut are also, wanting a fairly continuous flow of fiber in there as well. So in an ideal situation, we would feed a longer stem forage. We would allow horses to eat for as long as possible. But, there are times where it's actually in the best interest of the horse to feed pellets. If you have a horse that has poor dentition, an older horse that, the equine tooth is kind of like a lead in a mechanical pencil. It clicks down throughout its life and eventually runs out. And we don't have very good teeth or no teeth at all. Those horses really benefit from being, on a pelleted diet. I work with some horses that for other, medical reasons actually need to be on pellets for whatever reason. We use it when we're dealing with irritable bowel, or sometimes it's fecal water syndrome, when we've got horses in loose manure, passing liquid feces, passing liquid after manure. Those horses sometimes benefit from having some or all of their forage be in a hay pellet form. So I'm not ready to say that pellets are not good for horses. I think there's a lot of good reasons to feed pellets to some individual horses, but we have to understand kind of the pros and cons involved with that. And if possible, if we are going to lean heavily on pellets for the majority of the forage in the diet, try to feed lots of little meals. There are pellet dispensers out there that you can program to drop pellets at intervals throughout the day. And actually you can create an almost grazing simulation type environment with some of those innovations. So there are ways out there to feed pellets and actually mimic kind of a grazing and kind of get rid of some of those concerns that I mentioned before. And then of course, many of our performance feeds are in pellet forms, and I don't worry about that so much. There's a lot of benefit there. You can't sift out the ingredients the way you can potentially. We've all seen a horse eat a textured feed and like eat everything and leave the pellets, or eat the pellets and leave everything else. So the benefit of a pelleted performance feed is they can't do that, and everything gets consumed. So that's a great benefit of performance feed. And those horses are probably getting a hay or pasture forage, and so I'm not so concerned about a pellet in that situation either.
Okay. And Dr. Thunes, Cynthia has followed up, and she's clarified that she is talking about an extruded pellet, like a performance feed. So if you want to touch on that a little bit more, we know that a lot of things that we do in human diet or that's in human health news will trickle over into the horse world, and people will start talking about like a pelleted feed as being a processed feed and be concerned about it. Is that something that is a concern, or are there reasons to have those extruded pellets?
No, I actually actually don't have any problem with processing horse feeds. In fact, often they make them more digestible, which in some instances can make some ingredients safer to feed. So it's not, we're not talking deep fried Twinkies when we're talking about processed feed in the horse world.
It's not,
right?
Not lucky terms, yeah.
No, and what I didn't mention is, for example, like in a hay pellet, because you make the particle size smaller, it's actually more easily digestible. So again, and that's part of the reason why it's helpful in some of those horses with like an irritable bowel or a fecal water syndrome type situation, or if you have horses that are harder keepers. The surface area is increased because you've got a smaller particle size, so there's more surface area for bacteria to adhere to and for enzymes in the small intestine to work on. So you're actually going to get better digestion. So that can be a benefit in certain situations. There are certain ingredients that, for example, barley starch, corn starch, are not super digestible in the equine digestive tract. Those need to be processed and heat treated so that your horse can actually utilize them. And you'll see a lot of feed companies claiming all kinds of special technologies and the way they've treated their starch to make it safer for your horse. And that's kind of why. It's because it actually makes it more digestible. By heat treating it, you change the chemical structure of the starch in those grains and make them more digestible. And then they're less likely to end up in the hindgut. And if you end up with starch in the hindgut, you really mess up the hindgut microbial population. They don't like that at all. And so we really need, if we've got starch in the diet, we really need it digested and absorbed in the small intestine. So for those kinds of ingredients, processing is really important.
Dr. Jacobs, we have a question from Heather in our live audience. She wants to know if you can demystify whether oats and barley make horses hot. Isn't their behavior
great
being
question.
hot, not
For sure. Yes. Yeah, absolutely. It's a great question. And we hear this all the time, and oats and barley are ingredients that are very commonly fed to horses, but are also common as part of textured diets, or sweet feed, if you will. And oats and barley are fed to horses because they're decently high in calories. There's other benefits as well relative to the fibrous components that make up the hulls of the different seeds and things like that, but commonly added to diet, as an energy source. And so, horses become hot or have extra energy, when they have extra energy in their diet. And so certain horses will respond to certain diets in different ways. And for example, what I mean by that is you can feed a horse a diet that has the same amount of calories, so the same total amount of calories, but it derives those calories from different sources. So one could be from a textured feed, right, that derives its calories mainly from starches and sugars, versus a feed that is higher in fat and fiber, right? And you'll see horses that will react differently to both of those. And I have seen horses that become more energetic or hot, if you will, on both of those situations. And so sometimes it's a very individual and horse specific thing where you have to identify what is truly the best feed to feed your horse. The thing about oats and barley when fed as individual ingredients in that diet is they basically simply add calories. They don't add them in balance with the other nutrients that your horse needs, right? And so that's why, again, it's really important to understand the overall nutrient requirements of the horse and the overall nutrient delivery to the horse, as opposed to just, providing individual ingredients. So my recommendation for, anybody that has, seen their horse become, more energetic or have some, unwanted behavior when feeding a certain diet, whether it be oats or barley or a textured feed or a high fat and fiber feed, is to evaluate the other things going on, right? Is that horse simply receiving too many calories, right? What is that horse's daily calorie expenditure, right? Like Dr. Thunes was talking about earlier, right? And does that match with what the daily calorie intake is of that horse? Because I think we all, horse owners, we're all very well aware that if a horse has extra energy, they're going to find some way to get that energy out. And oftentimes it's going to be doing something we don't want them to do, whether it's being ornery under saddle, whether it's chewing up your barn, or whether it's playing rough with your other horses. They're going to find some way to utilize that energy. So if we match the calorie expenditure as best as we can with the calorie intake, there's less of a chance of that horse having some of those, unwanted behaviors, if you will. And then again, like I mentioned, it's testing out what is the best, overall diet for that horse.
And we have about a half hour left in the broadcast. So if you're sitting on your questions, go ahead and send those in to us. I have a live question for Dr. Thunes, and it's from Mary Jane. And she wants to know what the difference is between grass hay and alfalfa hay. Is alfalfa too rich for breeds like warm bloods?
Yeah, so alfalfa is a legume hay, and grass hay come in. They can be warm season grasses like Bermuda or cold season grasses like Timothy, and that can have some basic differences between them. But generally, when we think about legume hays like alfalfa, we think high protein, high calcium. They're typically higher calories pound for pound than a grass hay would be. So if you put like a pound of Timothy up against a pound of alfalfa, there's going to be very slightly more calories in that pound of alfalfa than in the pound of Timothy. I feed a lot of warm bloods alfalfa as part of their diet. I generally don't feed more than about 25-30% of the total forage intake as alfalfa. I tend to find more than that we have too much protein in the diet, a little too much calcium, which means they got to get rid of that somehow, which means they have to drink more water, urinate more to get rid of it. But I do find that the little extra protein and the slightly better amino acid profile of alfalfa can be beneficial, especially in performance horses. So unless there's a reason why a horse shouldn't have alfalfa, for example, we're trying to cut calories or whatever, I'm certainly not opposed to having some amount of alfalfa in the diet.
We have a question from our live audience from Janet. Dr. Jacobs, I'm going to give this one to you. She wants to know, is soybean meal bad for horses, and is it better to have a feed without soy in it?
Great question. Absolutely. Soy is another one of those kind of trigger ingredients for a lot of individuals. And we add soybean meal to equine diets for very good reasons. Soybean meal is a very good source of protein for horses. And soybean meal also has a very good amino acid profile, meaning not only does it have a lot of protein, but it has a very good quality protein as well relative to the amino acids that are in there. And so, soybeans have, I would say gotten a bad rap for a couple of reasons. And first and foremost is they are a trigger ingredient when it comes to equine allergies. We can spend a lot of time and probably a whole one of these podcast sessions, if you will, talking about equine allergies, and we'll try to wrap it up. I'll try to put it in a nice little bow here, and that equine allergies are common, but equine food allergies are actually relatively uncommon. And so it's actually difficult to diagnose equine food allergies. Serum allergy tests as well as skin tests are actually very inaccurate when it comes to the diagnosis of true equine food allergies. The best way to do that is actually through what we call true exclusion diets. So taking that individual ingredient out of the horse's diet and seeing if that allergic response improves. So, for horse owners, a lot of the times there is a belief that their horse may have an allergy to soybeans, specifically soybean meal, when in a lot of cases it's not entirely accurate. The other reason that soybeans have gotten a little bit of a bad reputation is because of the quantity of phytoestrogens that are contained in soybeans. Phytoestrogens are estrogenic compounds, so compounds that act similar to estrogen in the body. And what we see is that, yes, soybeans and soybean meal does contain these phytoestrogens, but other components of the horse's diet, specifically the grass that the horse eats, contain almost larger amounts of these phytoestrogens. And more importantly, there's actually been some research done at the University of Florida and some other places, ongoing research as well, that has evaluated phytoestrogens and their role in altering the reproductive cyclicity in mares and altering the reproductive performance in stallions. And there's absolutely no indication that that's true whatsoever. So for horses that don't truly have a real true allergy to soybean meal, their soybean meal and soybeans are a phenomenal ingredient to utilize in horse feeds due to their ability to provide really high quality protein in that diet.
We have another question about alfalfa. Dr. Thunes, I'm going to give this one to you. The question is, can alfalfa contribute to scratches or pastern dermatitis by increasing photosensitivity in horses?
This is a great question. I was just reading about this today. What are the chances?
Well, it's timely then.
It is very timely. Yeah. No, I'm working with a horse that has melanders. So I was doing some background work on that because there's something there about biotin, which I couldn't find any actual real research on, so I don't think that's a thing. But there is a potential photosensitization to alfalfa. So in some horses, UC Davis actually did some work on this. They had a number of horses that were brought into them that had broken out in photosensitive reactions, basically sunburn, right? And I mean, I saw photographs of them. I actually attended a talk by the pathologist that did the research, and it was nasty. And it was linked to alfalfa, but they were never able to actually find whatever the compound in the alfalfa was that triggered the photosensitization. So there are plants that we know that can lead to photosensitization, such as St. John's wort. And they've actually identified the chemicals in those plants that cause that. But in the case of alfalfa, they have not. And it is something that it's potentially individual horses. Now, scratches, that's a pastern dermatitis. That is, I'm certainly not a dermatologist, so it's a little different. I mean, it can be similar. It can be a photosensitization, and it could be due to that if your horse is sensitive to it. But certainly the ones that I saw, it was pretty extensive sunburn, like on their noses as well. And some of the paint horses had sunburns on other white areas of their body. So I think it's something we don't think about in the summer in horses. We see sunburn and we just think, oh, it's sunburn. And we don't realize that it can actually be due to a number of different things, either compounds in plants, or it may actually be due to some liver issues. So I would not casually pass off sunburn in a horse, I think it is worth a conversation with your vet to make sure that you're not actually dealing with any kind of secondary photosensitization due to liver issues. So I just want to kind of put that out there as well, because I don't think many people realize that that's actually a thing.
Our next question is for Dr. Jacobs, and it is from Robert in Massachusetts. And Robert asked if a few carrots given daily as treats require adjusting the horse's nutrition plan. Can you give them enough carrots where you need to change what you're feeding?
Yes, you can give them enough carrots, but it's highly unlikely. And a few carrots a day absolutely is not going to make any difference in the overall nutrition plan for the horse. When we think about a horse, consider a 1,200 pound horse that's eating 2% of his or her body weight, in any single day. That horse is going to be consuming, 24 to 25 pounds of dry matter on any given day. I don't know off the top of my head what a carrot weighs. I do know that it probably weighs, under about a quarter of a pound, and you're really not going to be making that much of a difference in the overall horse's diet. I do love, Robert, that you're thinking, about the horse's diet as a whole, because if you are providing, 3-4 carrots in the morning, 3-4 carrots at lunch, 3-4 carrots in the afternoon, couple that with some other treats here or there, maybe there is a consideration that you need to think about. But overall, you're really not going to be making that much of a difference in the horse's diet.
And Dr. Jacobs, yes.
Oh, sorry.
Yes, Dr.
I was going to say, Dr. Pagan actually looked at this because he helped source feeds for the Olympics. And at one Olympics, they were shocked at how many, literally it was like, I think over a ton of carrots they were asked to ship in. So and so they actually studied it. And because he was concerned, at least from a vitamin A standpoint, whether or not, if these competition horses were being fed this many carrots on a daily basis, did it need to be looked into? And so he actually did look at it, and the answer was no, it was not an issue.
Oh, well, that's
I remember talking to Dr. Pagan about that study, and he showed me the pictures of these literal pallets of carrots, and it was more carrots than I've ever seen before. So it was fantastic.
Yeah, I boarded this past winter at a barn where they got food service bags of carrots. I didn't know that you could get bags that big of carrots or carrots that were that big. So I can see horses getting plenty. We went through a lot of carrots at that barn, so very spoiled horses. But Dr. Jacobs, if you have a horse, like Dr. Thunes had mentioned earlier in our conversation about equine metabolic syndrome and insulin resistant horses, do you have recommendations for those horses that are sugar sensitive, what you can give as treats instead? I'm thinking of mine. I have one with PPID. It's really hard to get his medication in him without putting it in something sweet. I'm just like, oh, is the sweet thing that I'm sticking it in too much for him?
Yeah, it's a great question. There are some companies out there, Purina is one of them, that we have, treats that are designed for carb, sensitive horses, horses that are sensitive to non-structural carbohydrates. But again, largely a very small amount of a treat, like you had mentioned, to get some medication into that horse, it is not going to make that big of a difference. If there are concerns, about the overall starch and sugar, I would say, sure, stay away from something like a peppermint that is 100% sugar, and offer that horse something else, even, offering them a small part of their concentrate diet, as remove that from their AM and PM ration and provide them with a small portion of their concentrate diet as a treat, providing a horse with a small amount of a low starch and sugar feed as a treat. Horses that see something different from their current, their everyday diet is something that they're going to be very excited to see. So I would say that there's lots of options, out there for you to provide some of these things. Even making some apple sauces for your horse that don't have added sugar in them. Yeah, they do have some sugar, naturally occurring sugar, but again, it's such a small amount relative to the overall ration that horse is consuming on any given day, that it's not going to make that much of a difference.
And Natalie in our live audience asked a question along what I just asked you, and she's saying specifically for her horse with a history of laminitis, are carrots and apples too sugary for those horses? And
so
carrots
and so carrots and apples do have sugar in them, but again, I'm going to go back to again, commenting on it all goes back to the amount that you're feeding to that horse. A small amount of apple, a small amount of carrot, being fed to a horse, even with a history of laminitis or a horse that, is afflicted with equine metabolic syndrome, is not going to play havoc on their glucose and insulin response in their bodies.
Dr. Thunes, our next question is for you, and it's from Janelle in Washington, and she wants to know if teff hay is good for easy keepers.
Yeah, teff has become quite popular. When I lived in California, it was grown locally there, and at that time, it was that's where you got it from. And now I'm seeing it grown all over the country in the United States. So it's certainly gained popularity, and it is certainly very popular for people who have easy keepers. And there is this belief that it's sort of a safe hay, in inverted commas, for those easy keeper, insulin sensitive or insensitive rather horses. And I think on the whole, it is a good choice for those horses, but I just would caution that, I've definitely seen hay analyses for teff hays that I wouldn't consider safe for those horses. And I've seen hay analyses from other types of grasses, orchard, timothy, brome, that would be safe for those horses. So if you're feeding a horse with a laminitic history, I would really encourage you to test your hay if possible, because it's not as simple as just saying that all teff hay is safe for horses that need a low non-structural carbohydrate diet. There is variability based on growing conditions, region, maturity of the plant when it's cut. All those play a role in addition to the type of plant that it is. And so really without testing, you just don't know. And as I say, I've definitely seen tests on teff that were higher in non-structural carbohydrate than I generally would like to see for one of those types of horses. And I've seen other types of hay that people always say, oh, I would never feed that, it's going to be too high in sugar, but come back, actually safe to feed. So, but generally speaking, yes, it is a good choice.
Okay. We have a question from our live audience, Dr. Jacobs. This one's for you. Heather wants to know if milled flax is hard on a horse's liver.
That's a very interesting question. Dr. Thunes, I might turn this one over to you. I know a lot about flax. I haven't really evaluated flax relative to the liver of the horse. I know obviously flax, contains fat, and the horse's liver is responsible for producing, enzymes, that help to break that down. I haven't read anything specific to milled flax and its effect on the horse's liver, so I don't know if you have either.
Isn't there something, Dr. Thunes, that people are concerned about flax and want it's soaked or not soaked or something? This is ringing a bell. Does that ring a bell for you?
That's the cyanide. Yeah,
okay.
That's the cyanide compounds that people worry about. So maybe that's what they're worried about with the liver. And I should clarify before everyone's going, oh my God, there's cyanide in flax, and freaked out. Let me just back up here a second. So yes, there are compounds that have, I don't know if it is a cyanide compound, it certainly has cyanide-like tendencies. But it's very, very minuscule, and there's been research looking at it that it's not an issue. And I'm trying to recall, Dr. Jacobs, I don't know if you can chime in. I think if you soak it, you're more likely to release those compounds, and if you don't soak it, I'm trying to recall. But again, the amounts are so low, and you'd have to feed so much flax for it to be an issue that it's just not an issue. So I don't want anyone to panic about feeding flax. I feed flax personally. I don't have a problem feeding flax. So, as far as the liver thing, I'm sitting here and like you, I'm like, wow, this is an interesting question. I'm thinking actually, unless there's something I just don't know about, which is quite possible, I'm certainly not an expert in liver.
I learned something new in all of these things. So yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm thinking the omega-3s in flax might actually help the liver if you've got a horse that has any kind of liver inflammation type situation going on, because the omegas, that's why we tend to feed a lot of flax these days, is because yes, it is high in fat, but the type of fat tends to be it's higher in omega-3 fats than omega-6s, and we think of those as being fats that help regulate inflammation. And so if you have a horse that sort of has a liver condition, feeding omega-3 fats might be beneficial. But I would have to go away and do some research to really come up and give you a super confident answer on that, the role of flax in the liver.
Yeah, the only thing I would add when you talk about the cyanide toxicity, and this goes back to, the questions that we had previously about processing of grains. When you process flax, you reduce those components as well. You inactivate them. And so, processing flax, producing a pellet or an extruded nugget, or, providing to your horse milled flax that's heat treated reduces those issues, almost basically eliminates those issues as well. So that's why, again, to your point previously, processing is not a bad thing when it comes to some of the grains and the products that we feed to our horses, because it reduces or eliminates some of those potentials.
Right. And I know when I was a kid, we used to boil flax on the stove and make linseed jelly, which absolutely stinks and looks like snot. And the horses love it. But I will say that, omega fats are not very heat stable. So if you're somebody that's still out there kind of doing that traditional processing in your kitchen of cooking your flax before you feed it, you may actually be getting rid of some of the benefit of why you would feed it in the first place.
Yeah, because whole flax, it goes rancid pretty quickly, doesn't it? If it's not stored in the freezer.
Once you crack that shell, so it's like a lot of things like oats the same way, right? Once you crack that outer shell, all the goodies on the inside are now exposed to oxygen, and so there's oxygenation that can happen and degradation that will occur. So that's why most of the flax you buy ground, get a commercial sold ground, has been stabilized so that the fat doesn't go rancid and it maintains its nutritional value.
Yeah, I'm just old enough to remember when everyone just started feeding flax and would grind it in coffee grinders before there were any commercially available flax feeds. So sorry, Dr. Jacobs.
No, I was just going to add, and if you are feeding flax to your horses to add omega-3s to their diet, but you're worried about some of these compounds, the compounds are completely absent in flaxseed oil. So flaxseed oil is a way to provide the omega-3 fatty acids to your horse. And if you're concerned about it at all, flaxseed oil is a very safe and effective way to increase the omega-3 fatty acid concentration in your horse's diet.
Okay. Dr. Jacobs, our next question is for you. It's from Ray in Arizona, who wants to know if first cutting of hay is best for horses. So this is a hard one. Hay is getting really expensive. You kind of get what you get currently, at least in the market that I'm in. So he's asking about first cutting. I've always thought maybe second cutting was best for horses, but maybe you have a different information for us.
I absolutely love this question, and you're right. Hay is becoming hard to find and very expensive. If we take a step back and think real quick for those that still question, what does first cutting mean? What does second cutting mean? It means exactly that, right? First cutting is the first cutting of hay that comes off of a field, and second cutting would be the second cutting that comes off of that field. Typically, when we look at first cutting hay is typically a more mature plant, so you'll see more seed heads depending on the variety of grass, if you will. But you're also going to see a more dense hay, a thicker stem, but you're also going to see a hay that has a lower nutritional density, so less nutritional content. Versus a second cutting hay, the reason sometimes first cutting hay is less expensive is because that usually the first cutting produces more hay for the farmer. So that's just another thing to think about. Versus second cutting hay, which will typically have a little bit higher of a nutrient composition, but also that comes with that sometimes is a higher starch and sugar level. So, I don't like to say first cutting is better than second cutting hay because first cutting hay may be entirely appropriate for a certain class of horses or a certain group of horses versus other horses which may require the more nutrient dense hay that is present with a second cutting hay. So, it really just depends on what the individual needs of your horse, of your horses are. Dr. Thunes mentioned, getting your hay tested, which I can't agree with her more. I think getting your hay and your pasture tested is one of the most important things that you can do as a horse owner to understand what it is that you're feeding to your horse. But first cutting and second cutting hay, I would say one is not better than the other. They're just different from each other. And again, just to wrap it up, first cutting hay typically less nutritionally dense versus second cutting hay, which typically has a little bit higher nutrient level, calorie level, protein, but also starch and sugar level as well.
Okay. We have a follow-up question, Dr. Jacobs, from Betty in our live audience. She wants to know which hay is best for an insulin-resistant or metabolic horse.
Great question. I like to look at hays for insulin-resistant or metabolic horses that are lower in starch and sugar. Typically, it may be a hay that would have less voluntary intake, but you don't want one that's going to have, no voluntary intake, right? You don't want to feed. In some cases, I actually have recommended feeding straw to horses for those very insulin resistant horses. But, for the majority of metabolic horses, you want a hay that has a decently high ADF level, or acid detergent fiber level, and a neutral detergent fiber level, the NDF level, but that is low in starches and sugars as well. So I think of a hay, like even a mixed grass hay or a coastal Bermuda grass hay that will be lower in starches and sugars. There are some Timothy hays out there that are low enough in starch and sugar that would be appropriate for those horses as well. But again, you really want to test that hay because there's such a variability, when it comes to the hay that you're feeding horses. I have seen, Timothy hay test at, 12 to 18% starches and sugars, and I've seen Timothy hay test at, 6 to 9% starches and sugars. And so it can be very variable, depending on the hay that you're looking for. So for those horses that are, afflicted with metabolic syndrome or laminitis, a first cutting hay that's low in starch and sugar would probably be a very appropriate hay for that animal as well.
We have a question for Dr. Thunes. It's from Mary Jane in Florida, and she said that her barn gives the horses a bran mash once a week. Is it healthy for them?
Not really. Let's just start and cut to the chase, right? So the problem, I grew up doing this too. I come back from fox hunting as a kid and steaming, bran in the feed room, and smells amazing, and the horses love it, and you feel like giving them a lovely treat, and it just feels like a nice thing to do. And it's, we do it because we think it's going to help them, to have a laxative property and help make sure they don't have any impactions and that kind of thing. But the reason it does that is that it sort of disrupts the hindgut microbial population. So grew up in Pony Club, and we have 10 rules of feeding. And one of those rules of feeding is make changes to your horse's diet slowly over time. And I think many horse owners do that, right? They kind of wouldn't dream of just like switching their performance feed, like say going from a performance feed to a senior feed overnight or whatever. And yet somehow when it comes to bran mashes, all bets are off, all rules are out the window, and we just make these suddenly rapid changes. We just stop feeding what we were doing, and then on Sunday we feed a bran mash or what have you. And so that it completely shocks the digestive system. And that's one of the reasons why it has a laxative property, is that you kind of, really disrupt the microbial population, which is not something we really want to be doing. So, we've moved away from bran mashes as being something that should be done on a weekly basis. It used to be part of what we used to do, especially in our working horses that worked Monday through Saturday and had Sundays off. We would cut out their grain because they would tend to be feeding very high grain diets like cob and the like. And then on Sundays when they didn't work, we would cut all that out and just feed them a bran mash. And then Monday they'd be back to grain again. We know more now. We understand the digestive tract better, and we realize that that's just not a smart thing to be doing. But people want to feed mashes, right? It feels good to feed your horse something, especially in a cold climate, something kind of, you feel like warm and toasty, you're going to warm them up. So if you're somebody that really wants to do that, there's a couple of options. There are a number of mash products out on the market that are a little more like what you feed your horse on a day-to-day basis, that won't disrupt their digestive tract quite as much. You can just take what you feed normally and turn it into a mash. You could take, even if you just feed your horse hay pellets, right? Turn that into a mash. Turn your horse's regular senior feed into a mash. Like, you can create a mash very easily without relying on bran.
We have a question from Debbie in our live audience, Dr. Jacobs. This one's for you. She wants to know if apple cider vinegar has any benefits for horses.
Yeah, apple cider vinegar is something that I've actually looked at and started to think about from a research perspective. And again, it comes from the human side of things. Apple cider vinegar has been indicated to play a role in affecting the microbiome, of the horse. There's also been discussion of apple cider vinegar, and its ability to acidify the horse's stomach. Now we think about that and go, well, wait a second, aren't we trying to sometimes buffer the horse's stomach to reduce the incidence of gastric ulcers? So, I'd say that the marketing far outweighs the actual research as it relates to apple cider vinegar. For me, I would say this is one of those ingredients or one of those compounds that fed to horses, based on all of the data that we know right now, it's not going to hurt your horse. Will it provide any benefit to your horse that we know of at this point? I can't say definitively. I've seen everything from the ability of apple cider vinegar to ease arthritis in horses, as it relates to mane and tail conditions or treating hoof problems. And, it's highly unlikely that this one, product does all of those things. But there is one, aspect of apple cider vinegar that has gained some interest as it relates to natural insect control. There's other compounds like garlic and lemongrass that have also, gathered some attention in this area as well. But when you feed your horse this higher, or feed your horse this apple cider vinegar, there's a thought that some of this does get excreted through their skin, or some of the breakdowns of this get excreted through their skin, which actually detracts from biting mosquitoes and flies. And so I would say that if you feed apple cider vinegar to your horse, and I personally couldn't tell you how much to feed them, I would imagine it's not as highly palatable, or it's not very palatable, so it would probably decrease the palatability of what you put it on. But feeding apple cider vinegar to your horse is probably not going to hurt them in any way. There is also some really interesting data out there in humans, specifically related to apple cider vinegar and its ability to increase salivation. And this is one of the areas that I'm interested in apple cider vinegar, is if we can feed this to the horse and actually increase the amount of saliva that they can produce, because as Dr. Thunes said earlier, it does increase the buffering ability, or the buffering capacity of that saliva into the stomach. But also, to the previous conversation around choke, saliva is very important for lubrication of the esophagus. So if we can increase the amount of saliva that's produced, well, that would be pretty fascinating as it relates to reducing the risk of choke and otherwise. Is that true in horses? I don't think we know the answer to that question yet. There's still a lot of research out there to be done.
Well, we have about 3 minutes left, so we're going to do a rapid fire round here with a couple of questions. Dr. Thunes, we have Jody in Florida wants to know if it's okay to feed alfalfa in horses, or free feed alfalfa to horses.
Oh, free feed. It wouldn't be my first choice, just because it is exceptionally high in protein and also pretty high in calcium. So it wouldn't be my first choice. But I think we're entering a period with hay prices and availability that sometimes you just got to do what you got to do, but it wouldn't be my first choice. Yeah,
I have one. I think if I free fed her alfalfa, her face would be in it 24 hours a day. So,
right.
Yeah. Dr. Jacobs, we have a question from Tammy in Georgia, who wants to know, how soon after feeding a horse can the horse be worked?
Yeah, great question. It depends. What are you feeding your horse, right? It used to be that no, don't feed your horse before they work at all. But now that has shifted very drastically to it's actually a good idea to feed your horse some forage before they exercise. It actually keeps the gastric acid that's in their stomach from splashing around, as Dr. Thunes was talking about earlier, reducing the risk of gastric ulcers and gastric ulceration. We do like to delay working until 3 to 4 hours, at least, after that horse has had a large concentrate meal. And this really relates to the insulin response as that horse is consuming. The peak insulin response after consuming a meal is typically around 2 to 3 hours after that horse has consumed that diet. And by about 4 hours afterwards, that insulin is returned back to baseline levels. And why this is important is because of the mobilization of glucose that's necessary for that horse to perform whatever that activity is. And so if insulin levels are very high, circulating insulin levels, the mobilization of glucose becomes very difficult in that horse's body, which can potentially reduce that athletic performance. So when we're talking about concentrates and grains, I do like to say, don't exercise that horse or work that horse for about 3 to 4 hours after they have consumed that meal. But when it comes to forage, I think it's very important to feed that horse up until the point that they're going to be exercising.
Okay. And Dr. Thunes, we have a question from Susan in North Carolina, who wants to know how soon after riding she can let her horse eat.
Yeah, again, similar kind of thing. It depends what it is. They can have access to forage pretty quickly afterwards. I tend to hold off on concentrate grains for a little bit longer. But forage can be actually a good thing to put in front of them, actually help with rehydration, because when they eat forage, they actually tend to drink. So it can actually be beneficial from that respect.
Okay. Well, thank you for getting to a few more questions there at the end. We are out of time for tonight, but I want to thank both of you, Dr. Thunes and Dr. Jacobs, for joining us. It was a fun conversation.
Yeah, it was great to be here.
I appreciate the invitation. This was fantastic.
We also want to thank Purina for sponsoring this event. And finally, thank you to our audience for listening and submitting all these great questions. Until next time, from everyone at The Horse, have a great night.